everyone. Thanks for coming to the session. I hope you're all enjoying your lunches today. I am Jessica Mendoza. I am part of the advisory board for the Young Pros, and I work at the Associated Press, and I'm going to be introducing Michael Horn. So right now you are here for the LEAP session, which is on from insights to impressions. And Michael Horn is the Chief Analytics Officer at Resonate, which is a SaaS programmatic data platform that really opens new possibilities for new marketers. At Resonate, he directs massive scale survey research and big data. He develops new measurements and targeting methodologies. Here he's going to present a little bit more about what he does in his current role and how he got there.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you for your patience on getting everything set up. I feel like that the moment in those spy movies where turns out you're all wired up, and it's the, no. So the thing about presenting two sessions back to back where it's the same content is you guys are kind of the warm-up, so I'm gonna mail it in, not take it too seriously, just as practice run for the real one. So just keep that in mind if I seem to tune out for a little bit. But thank you coming back from lunch. So quick question, how many of you today in your work work or have access to a data scientist? Just show of hands. All right, not too many so far. And how many of you are using big data tools, so massive scale, either behavioral data or purchase data on a regular basis?
Can you hear me with this?
Okay, not bad, not bad. Okay, so I'm going to talk today primarily about what I'm calling the leap, and it's how you get from the great, brilliant idea that you had to an actual flighted campaign. And how many of you, I mean, you're pretty early in your careers, but you probably had some experience, some moment where you felt like you were standing on top of the mountain. You're like, this is the idea, this is the one that's gonna make it to the field, and people are gonna go, wow. And then you have this moment where you're like, well, okay, genius insight, how is this gonna happen? How will this get translated in a way that what's true about my audience target, what I discovered that is the truth, is going to play its way through into the messaging and into the media. And the first thing you find out, at least when you're part of a larger organization like an agency, is that you're here and then there's like this media planning organization. And so you thought you were already on top of the mountain. It turns out there's this other mountain over there and they've got this really important role. And then if you're especially in a larger agency, you find out there's this third team, which is the investment team, and they're all the way on another mountain. And you're starting to get a little bit worried and realize you're feeling a little vulnerable there. And now suddenly, instead of feeling like you're on top of the mountain, you're like, rescue me, because it's still got to get from you to media planning to investment to publishers who actually have the audience. So at this point, you're thinking, okay, I can do this. I just need to walk this like high wire from here to the other department, over to investment, over to publishers, and then I'll be able to get my idea out into the world. And then you realize that high wire is actually made entirely of PowerPoint slides. And that you have to write the brief, which will then get translated into the media plan, which then gets translated into an RFP, which who knows what happens on the publisher side with that RFP. And so you're thinking, oh no, like my great idea, because you wrote it as purchase drivers and customer journey and the personal values that shape people every day. And then the media planners, they wrote it as reach and frequency and composition. And then the investment people, and by the way, if they're digital media planners, they layered on all this other stuff. And the investment people started talking about properties and currency and efficiencies. And these are just the languages that each of these speak, but each of these translation layers further dilute what was your original idea and your original audience definition. So by the time you put all this together and the publishers are out there optimizing on their delivery and viewability and yield optimization, you're like, okay, FML, what am I going to do? And this view of the industry and how the industry is changing, are we going? Yes, is really about distance. And it's really about the distance between, we're on the same channel. It's about the distance between you and these other groups and you and the marketplace in a couple of distinct ways we're going to talk about. The first is organizational distance. So agencies have had to re-architect themselves. Depending where you are, this may be happening right now, or it certainly happened within the last 5 to 7 years. In terms of the relationship, well, are you a TV planner or a video planner? Are you a magazine planner, print planner, or are you looking at cross-channel and iPad insertion? So all of these types of organizational distances are getting recalibrated as groups reorganize. There's also a technical disconnect. The tools you use as strategists and researchers are not media planning tools necessarily, or they're not optimization tools, they're not investment tools. So you're simply not using platforms that speak to each other in many cases, and that's a real distance to cross. There's also KPI divergence, that you identified in partnership with the client what the communications goal of the campaign is. Will the campaign actually be optimized that way? Is that what you're going to be driving consumers and viewers and audiences to do? And then even beyond that, there's incentive misalignment. You as a strategist are incentivized on things like innovation, customization. Your job is to come up with the next brilliant idea, right? But the people that are over in the investment and media planning groups may actually be incentivized on something totally different. Their goal is on efficiency, or it's on savings, or it's on a direct behavioral metric, which isn't really even a proxy for what you planned against. So these are all really significant gaps. But the one that I'm going to spend the most time talking about are scales. You, as a strategist and a researcher, sometimes that brilliant inspiration comes from just talking to somebody, or it comes from an ethnography, or it just comes from this moment, the realization you had talking to a customer, to a client, to a partner. It's a qualitative exercise in many cases. Versus these guys over here in investment and publisher land, they're thinking in terms of hundreds of millions. And I want to play this out for just a minute in terms of like how it is we got to the place we're in. Say a brief segue on orders of magnitude. So, and with a little creative license here, because I mean, but you start on the qualitative scale with strategies and methods like ethnographies, where you want to really get in the heads, you literally follow around the audience target. Any of you done or worked with ethnographic data? It's really fun, but it's like hyper qualitative. And then with usability, maybe you have 20 or so interviews. You're watching how people use a product, how they interact with it, and you get some really interesting insights that way. Or then focus groups. Maybe you've got groups of 10, 12, 15 people. You do it in a bunch of cities, talk to different audience targets. You got 200 people. And then custom research, maybe you're talking to 2,000 people. You're doing some interviews with the help of a panel. Syndicated research, if you're lucky, you get 20,000 people in your target to enable you to build out a clustering exercise, a segmentation layer to understand how people use a given product or a category. But each of these things, with each of these, you're getting further and further away from a initial qualitative strategic understanding, but you get closer to activation. You get closer to the audience scale, to the campaign scale that you'll eventually see. So social media analytics, which I imagine many of you have had an opportunity to use, you're getting up larger. Now, on the one hand, these are people who are hand raisers, but you're getting an understanding of your audience at a more quantitative scaled fashion, and CRM is at much the same level. And then these online and set-top box panels. You start getting towards the census scale, but it can still be a selection of either opted in or otherwise enrolled 2 million. And then you've got offline purchase data, maybe that's 20 million. And then hovering out there, you've got the census scale. Observation, delivery, this is where all those impressions are actually happening. So a lot of the disconnect that happens between strategy and insight and kind of the brilliant genius idea is how you translate it from sometimes all the way from 2 out to 200 million. And that's a really, really, really big leap. So one of the ways I like to think about how we overcome this and what technological opportunities there are is with this quote from Lewis Carroll. So those of you who know Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass. And then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on a scale of the mile to the mile. Have you used it much? I inquired. It has never been spread out yet, said Miner. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So now we use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well. Half tongue-in-cheek, but what we find is that the latest generation of analytics tools, and this is where for those of you who are working with big data observation, behavioral purchase data, you're actually using the market at census scale as your panel. You're developing the insights off of the fully scaled addressable data set. This turns out to be a really different process, and it has huge implications for the way that you're going to work with planners and with investment people and the way that you're going to relate to the publishers and to the audience. To think about how that looks, it's starting from your genius insight, and instead of having to bounce it through different organizations, different languages, and different scales, it's imagining what it would mean if you had a straight line between you and the audience, and you could directly observe and directly target the audience at an individual addressable level. And it was only a few years ago that this seemed more or less like a pipe dream, because the ability to machine the data fast enough to get not just kind of DR metrics, but to get true brand metrics at census scale seemed pretty much impossible. And yet now we're getting progressively closer and closer and closer. I'm going to talk about that for a minute. So it's data science and data scientists who provide this bridge between what would otherwise be this huge leap or a tight wire act between these different components of the industry. Let's talk about what that data science leap means. First, and this is if any of you are ex-KCD fans, which as geeks you should be, a little view here on mathematicians, and you'll note data scientists are not up here, but let's talk about what this means. So we got sociologists over here, and by the way, we are closest to sociologists in what we do, applied sociology. And then we've got psychology looking at this, and sociology is just applied psychology, and biologists and chemists and physicists, and we're getting progressively more and more pure. And I used to lead a team of data scientists, and I still kind of indirectly lead them, and I once witnessed a near physical fight over whether data science was closer to physics or to being an applied blue-collar skill, where they're both brilliant data scientists, by the way, who are arguing this, and both who have PhDs. But one saying, well, really all we do is we just kind of poke and prod and parameterize the math. We're not inventing any new math. We're just using algorithms that have already been invented. And then the other, who is a theoretical physicist who actually worked on particle accelerators before he got into advertising. What a waste of his life. No, for particle physics, what do you care? No, he was arguing that what he was doing was advancing the application of science in its truest form to capture the essence of humanity. And they were like totally at it. But the bottom line here is that data science itself is this confluence of different fields. And you see this all playing out between people who are just doing mathematics or statistics or computer science. And we see that just in the last 10 years or so, they've converged and this kind of nuclear fusion happened and gave life to an entirely new career that previously had not existed, and then suddenly gets named to being the sexiest job of the 21st century. But whatever a data scientist is supposed to be or whatever they do, there are a couple things that are fundamentally true about the value that they bring to our industry. So one way to see this, and one place to find data scientists, are these new conventions spring up, and the biggest one is KDD. And I love this. Is the 20th ACM SIG KDD Conference on Knowledge Discovery and Data Mining, just a short title there, which is that actually stands for the Association of Computing Machinery Special Interest Group on, good Lord. But what I love about this actually is that they decided to theme last year's conference Data Science for Social Good, which I found a little bit ironic at the time because a lot of the initial involvement in data science in our industry, in marketing, was actually kind of evil. And I mean that only half jokingly. There was this great quote from Jeff Hammerrucker at Facebook: "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads." And the reason why I'm calling that out especially, even in a house built on clicks, is that when we think about persuasion, and we think about brand marketing, what we're trying to do is persuade, is influence people to take an action, to change their perception. And that in many cases, data science, the first job in advertising, was actually just to very specifically identify who was most likely to click on ads. And there was a lot of gaming that went on. Initially, it was just a lot of the mathematics were first applied to driving up kind of fake performance. But now that we've gotten through that kind of immature state, and people like Jeff Hammerrucker have gone on to found Cloudera, which is a big data tool set in the cloud that many of us will indirectly use without even knowing about it, is that data scientists in marketing have now turned their attention to saying, we don't just want to drive clicks, We want to drive business results. We want to actually make that leap to addressable targeting, to individual targeting, to targeting on brand attributes without having to go across between different tool sets. And as you think about how your career is going to change kind of over the next 5-7 years, this is largely where there's going to be a huge impact. And largely it's because things like the relationship between a panel and programmatic media that used to be totally different languages now find themselves in this realm where you can go back and forth between them. And we're constantly finding new modeling techniques that enable that flexibility. And so data scientists start playing this role. Any of you know what this is? Recognize it? Yeah, good job. The Rosetta Stone, they're playing this role of being the universal translator between attributes that previously had nothing to do with each other or were at best correlated at a highly aggregate level. And they're finding ways of creating experiments and otherwise predictive models that tie these things together. Another good example is what had been really separate tools for research and for activation. And this is obviously my soapbox and something I'm very passionate about, but as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, whenever you said that the companies that are in charge of measuring outcomes should also be involved in targeting, you'd get this objection, which was that, well, that's like the fox in the hen house. And I think that what's fascinating is in a very short period of time, those barriers, so with Nielsen buying Exolate, for example, you have an old world research company buying a DMP. We're seeing these types of transformations happen where that boundary between measurement and activation and targeting is really getting broken down, and it's happening very, very quickly. And then another thing that gets broken down is this notion of audiences and individuals, right? That we deal in audiences, we deal in aggregates, but the reason why we do something like that is largely out of a convenience for media planning, right? We need to put people into a seating section, right? Over here, people tend to be richer. Over here, people tend to be poorer. Over here, they have this demographic mix. We do that because that's been the currency, right? The currency is to buy demographic groups. But now we have this interesting situation where that leap between your idea and the execution of that idea can actually leverage these big data and machine learning techniques to humanize instead of abstracting and objectifying individuals. So you're going to be living in a world for most of your careers where you don't have to rely on a demographic shortcut, and what are effectively kind of assumptions about audiences. You can actually qualify people by attitudes or directly by their behaviors or their interests in a way which is fundamentally allows them to be much more diverse as individuals. I do a lot of work on the political side as well as brand marketing. And one thing that never ceases to amaze me is just the number of times in our country's political history when shorthand put people into kind of these seating sections, put people as soccer moms, whether such a thing really existed, from a statistical, from a measurable perspective, but it became an assumption that's a very useful shorthand, but may actually be misleading when it comes to the data itself. So what does this mean? If we want to try to humanize people in the context of big data, well, it means we have to be able to understand why people do things, to pull insights directly into being audiences. And just, from my world, the things that I think about are like, if you knew this about this person, this complex person, and you could address that about them individually, how would it change the way you planned? How would it change the way that you build your insights? And so things that become unlikely events, right, that you would never think about as your mass lowest common denominator target, like people who think that ovens are really fun and exciting, but this guy with the poor pig over there, he thinks that ovens are really exciting, so maybe that's a message that would resonate best with him. And I'm probably just kind of playing fun with this, but there are also some very serious applications of it, which is that people who do not get typecast into the roles of being active civic players. In, again, my political work, you want there to be room for diversity on the stage that as the broader consumer audience and the broader voter audience. And we want to be able to target people based on the things they feel passionately about, not just the behavior that qualifies them as a target. I like this example also of the fact that you can exhibit these contradictions. You can be the biker dude who really wishes he didn't pollute as much. Like, these things exist. Or people who don't fit the textbook romance novel cover definition, but are very much driven by a desire for love. Or this was, when you think about people whose lives are shaped by technology, like there's no one whose lives are revolutionized more than those who just otherwise have not been able to interact in society in these ways. And we as marketers can actually measure and activate on these, what might be very small but very powerful and resonant segments. And then just one more example, or two more examples of this. When you're targeting a person based on a psychographic, you can get to things that are fundamentally true about them and break through in a way that are different from a demographic distillation. And this is probably one of the ones we're all guilty of. The 84% of the population who only buys insurance because of other people's mistakes while we're texting on our phones. Anyway, just to kind of come back to the core purpose here, what we're going to see happening, and this is going to happen fast, so don't blink, is that these disciplines, planning and investment, are very quickly going to find themselves pulled right into the data science line. So as opposed to having different tool sets, separate skill sets, they will find themselves playing on the same line and moving audiences back and forth along it. And you're going to be the start of that process, but it may well give you as a planner and researcher much greater direct visibility and the ability to test hypotheses in a more direct and powerful way off of your original genius insight, which is a really powerful thing for you. So that's the leap that I think that all of us are likely to experience in the next few years. And before I go to questions, which I hope there are some because I've raced through this really, really fast, I will leave you with a cheat sheet. And this is especially based on some of the mix of brand and political work my company does, just with a little cheat sheet on what different types of data and different scales of data are good at and bad at, and examples of where you can find them. So if you have found something like this, I'll even have that emailed around to the list because it can be really useful in thinking about what question am I really trying to answer and how close to execution do I want to get. So a lot to race through. What can I pause and go back to or talk about? What's surprising or not surprising? Or do I need to pick on people in the back? Because that's always a fun thing. Yes?
So I work on the ad sales side of the business, and I'm on a publisher. And so I always think of the upfront.
Yeah.
So obviously this was somewhat of a game-changing upfront, this past upfront, and there's a lot of speculation going to calendar now we're dealing with, and traditional broadcast upfront in the summer. What's going to be the impact of this on the upfront?
Yeah, I think. Now, I'm a digital native, so I'm kind of as old as a digital native can be.
And just to be clear, I'm cross-platform.
Yeah. So I think, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. From a standpoint of what you've seen just happen even in the last couple of years, and especially like the delayed viewing data changes or the entry of set-top box data into TV measurement, like how have you seen that change the dynamic either within the teams or in the relationship between publishers and the buy side?
Yeah, there are some people behind me who work with me who can chime in, but feel free. I won't call you out. I think we have hired, he doesn't go by the title of data scientist. I think some could argue he's in that data scientist role. And his team has grown and has expanded across our portfolio of networks. And I do think there is some kind of pilot, like they spoke about Viacom Vantage earlier, those kind of technologies that will hopefully impact. The problem with Viacom Vantage right now is I think there are only 12 accounts, 12 advertisers that were actually using it. And so again, talking about scale and how that impacts, when you have hundreds of upfront accounts, how does that work?
Yeah, I know that, and then at a corporate level, and this is because you're part of a huge organization like that, Disney Corp and everything on down has a lot of initiatives around, Blue Kai and kind of like a corp-wide DMP and being able to identify audiences across franchises. That'll be disruptive, but it will take years to implement. So I think part of it is just that you're at a level where it's probably going to be another year or two before it really sinks in, and people will approach it in lower risk ways than the upfront, right? So you're going to see in scatter and digital only buys opportunities to purchase audiences. I do think that the 2016 election, especially because will be a chance for the presidential campaigns to push the limits. What's interesting about presidential campaigns is that they completely dismantle themselves, right? Within 18 months, they assemble and dismantle themselves. So on the one hand, that's horribly bad and inefficient because they never get really good at what they're doing, but it means they end up pushing the limits a lot because they're not bound by their legacy technologies. One of the reasons you heard about like the Obama team doing all this really advanced work in the last cycle was because they weren't bound to their legacy process and systems because it didn't exist. And so I could imagine some of the larger TV buys on the political side being influenced by the political cycle.
And I work at AMC Networks,
Oh,
and we
there you
actually,
go.
I think 2 years ago, the president of AMC Networks had
Yeah.
an offsite where his name's his first name is Chomsky, I forgot his last name, but he was in charge of analytics for the Obama campaign,
there
and
you
they
go.
actually had the whole conversation that's kind of
Great.
started this whole data science initiative at the company.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and the one other comment about that, which is useful to mention, is that even in the last Obama campaign, there were data scientists, but they were teams of data scientists. They would go away for a few weeks, they'd come back with the new model. And the big difference between what happened then and what's happening now is the automation of data science, where instead of being like you go away for a few weeks and the model comes back, instead these are continually updating. Just the nature of the infrastructure and the speed of those refreshes in this cycle is totally different from what happened in 2012.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting when you look at like NBC Universal, like they just invested in BuzzFeed and Vox, and kind of like the digital players, and now again going back to the upfront, they're translating. In theory, they're going to sell. If you're Toyota, you can buy an ad on BuzzFeed, but you can also buy an ad on USA linearly.
Oh, yeah.
And like, what does that mean when it talks about addressability and segmentation and all of that?
Yep, and the buy side has all the same things to figure out, right? If you're Group M and you're figuring out how to handle all the buying efficiencies and programmatic workflow, and all the people you have to retrain and hire, this is a huge period of change. Great line of thought. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. What sets a data scientist apart from a data analyst? And I ask this because, thank you. I think over the past couple of years, the terms have been used interchangeably. Is it a set of skills, whether it's hard or soft skills? Is it the ability to, this distance between impressions and insight, as you have outlined out there? So what exactly sets apart the two areas, and where do you think it's going in the next 5, 10 years?
I love that question. I've hired a lot of both, and here's the best like overall synthesis I can encourage you to think of, is that data scientists are by their nature experimentalists. That they want to try 1,000 different solutions, know 1,000,000 different solutions, know 1,000,000,000 different solutions. They will find ways to parameterize machine learning, and these are like, as analysts, we tend to look at a data set, we do a lot of visual analysis, we do some regression, we do some correlation. We tend to think, though, in terms of a backwards-looking view of the universe. We're trying to explain phenomenon that were already happened, they were delivered on a campaign, or it was data collected via a survey, versus a data scientist is focused much more so on prediction, right? They're trying all these different solutions to more efficiently, to more effectively, to more precisely predict an outcome. And predictive modelers use a somewhat different tool set, but it's largely they're trained to think as physicists, to think as in terms of the types of mathematics they're using. It's much less stats, and it's much more this thinking around what is the theoretical maximal performance, and I'm going to do as many iterations as I need to get to that answer. So they come at it from a very different perspective, and I've in many cases had data scientists and more traditional analysts working together on projects, and they each can be highly complementary, but they also each can often misunderstand each other's jobs, right? Where whether it's a difference in skill sets, but also just a difference in their orientations. Great question. It is, by the way, I mean, like this happens in these bubble cycles where right now there's a huge demand for data scientists and not necessarily a huge demand for statisticians. What this means is people just start calling themselves data scientists, and there's no degree, or there's not a traditional method of validating that someone's a data scientist in the same. I mean, it's just kind of a weird space right now where these things are evolving. Great question. Yeah.
I feel like this leap has a lot to do more with media planning and buying that particular type of industry. How do you think this leap is different when you think about a manufacturer thinking about their product roadmap, or a retailer thinking about their line manufacturers coming in for line reviews and adjusting assortment and redesigning entire categories. How do you think this leap is different?
I'll say a couple things. One is it's not my specialty, so I'll address the question, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on it if you have perspectives. One is that the overall feedback cycle. I mean, syndicated research is among the slowest of the research types, and it can be 6, 9, 12 months before you get data back. There was a famous thing of MRI at the time when the iPad came out, managed to miss the entire uptake cycle of the iPad because it occurred just like during one survey interval. And I think that what's happening is that both driven by the manufacturers and the marketers, we've recognized we just have to be much faster in turning these things around. But part of it is the ability to use social media analytics or search analytics as leading indicators for adoption and uptake. You can see what features people are searching on. You can see what the comparative demand is. So the models that used to predict box office numbers, for example, have gotten much more sophisticated using and I'm seeing the nods here on viewership generally, because you've got so many indicators apart from the Nielsen ratings that may come back 7 or 10 days later in terms of like the latent viewing, as opposed to what do you see happening right now, the buzz that's generated around different products and shows. So we end up doing kind of this ongoing qualitative research, which is then a leading indicator for our quant, and that's only going to increase as the measurability improves. But that data becomes really valuable. So Twitter taking its fire hose back in-house, and the companies that are Facebook restricting a lot of the way in which you can access Facebook data. These are all, especially these social media companies, recognizing the way in which their data is being used as a predictor and making sure that they get the benefit of that data as well. Was it the IBM? I know that's the next session over, but IBM's investment in social fire hose data is a great example of that, where they wanted to have in their Watson capability, they wanted to invest really heavily in those types of rapid leading indicators. Did you have any other observations in terms of what you've seen happening or changes in toolset?
Sure. I guess I'm on now?
Yeah.
I currently work with a lot of consumer electronics manufacturers. My role is going to be changing in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be supporting a major retailer in this voice channel. So I'm just trying to think about how I can take some of the learnings from today, because my job will be to essentially help this retailer win and grow their position within their category. So I'd be taking on a very category management type role. So I just wanted to get a sense of how you thought it might be different.
That helps, and let me actually tell you a really tangible example in part from this morning. Because we run, Resonate has both a syndicated research kind of training core and then this addressable activation arm, and we weld the two together. We recently decided to not ask questions about CPG consumption, just to forget it, not worth it. Why do we do that? Because we found it was actually more time effective and cost effective and more flexible for us just to license that data on an ad hoc basis from companies like Datalogix. So we can overlay the Datalogix data with our panel and with our cookies and with all of our big addressable data, and it's actually much more flexible on behalf of our audience of CPG advertisers or retailers to be able to pull that data and have it on a rolling census scale, as opposed to trying to ask about CPG consumption in a syndicated context. And I was talking this morning actually with somebody who else runs another syndicated platform, and he was like, yep, we're gonna do the same thing. We're just gonna say, forget it, we're not gonna ask about self-reported consumption, we're just gonna use this census scale offline purchase data as our proxy.
So with some of our point of sale data, a lot of it is we're working with retailers or manufacturers, and I'll have experience on both sides. The insight that we might find is going to be very different than an insight like that we might find for, say, media. An insight could demonstrate to a manufacturer that they have $100 million opportunity because they're not getting distribution at a key retailer that is driving growth. That's the kind of insight that we're bringing to our clients and our retail partners. So that's why I was just wanted to get a sense of how you thought this leap was different, because the plan to action is going to be
it's all
Not
part of
completely different, but still very different.
It's all part of the same ecosystem of change, right? I mean, once you've made a data set addressable, it gets pulled in by all these disciplines, whether it's for media mix and attribution or it's for initial strategic insight. It's only going to accelerate as those pipes get laid in, because this isn't a batch operation anymore. This is just going to be the ongoing flow of data at census scale. Okay, we have like another 5 minutes or so, I think. 5 minutes, yeah. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I mean, what kinds of changes have you seen within your own organizations, like in the time that you've worked in this space, which in some cases for you might be between 3 and 7 years? What have you seen happen just in that time frame that was most disruptive or maybe scariest for some of your colleagues? Yeah,
I
good.
would say digital for sure because we're in traditional buying like television, radio, and so digital. Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm in traditional buying, radio and TV, and
Yeah.
definitely the transition to digital, it has been a journey, and we're still transitioning, and we're learning about programmatic buying. So all of that is being played out on our field, and we're just trying to figure things out. I'm part of the media planning and with the buying team. So just seeing even digital audio streaming incorporated in our buys, it's like a killer. But we're learning, and I think that's disruptive.
Yeah. I gave a presentation recently. It was to a leading media agency, and their EVP, North American Head of Strategy, was in the room, and I did kind of a mix of presentation, but also showed some screenshots of what our platform looks like and kind of how it works. And at the end of it, she kind of turned to her group, and she said, "Pay attention, or if you don't, it is at your peril." Because that is what the future of marketing looks like. I mean, it's bringing that type of data ecosystem across where it's audience spanning touch point, and then with a programmatic audience delivery, it's a strange thing to see when you see what are 4 different tools welded together, and that's very much the time that we're in. Methodologically, it's harder to do than it looks, but it's all coming together. And then in back. Yeah.
I think for me at least personally, the big data is great. What is the downside? I feel that with big data, I'm being spied on, NSA type.
Yeah.
So, what's the negative of this whole?
What a great question. So this is the core privacy question of what do we give up for our free internet? This value exchange in advertising is obviously is not a new story, right? I think back, when I was in college, and this is now a while back, I had this great technology and privacy course that was actually taught by a former NSA agent. At the time it was interesting, think about how much less the NSA was doing. And I'm not going to categorically dismiss your question, because I think it's actually a great question, but he was very dismissive. He was saying, nothing that we at the NSA did is anything close to what your credit card company does, and I don't see anybody giving up their credit cards. So if you're using just for the convenience, right, your credit card is saving you the trouble of getting cash or writing a check. And what you're giving up for that convenience of using your credit card from a privacy standpoint is really interesting. So, that said, my company scrapes a lot of data. We're consuming the content you consume at a page level. By you, I mean basically all of you. And so you land on a page, and it's not enough to us to even know that you landed on that page. We actually scrape the content of the page. So we see you on the page, we scrape the content, we run it through natural language processing algorithms, we say, oh, here are the 10 topics that you, anonymous cookie, were reading about. And that topic graph becomes the feature vector for our big data models. But basically, and in order to do that, I just had to watch 200 million people moving around the web, scraping all the content they consumed. Now, we are a purely anonymous platform. We have no PII, so I have no idea what your name is or what your address is or your family, but I'm observing passively all of this. So from a regulatory standpoint, as long as we don't mix PII and all this anonymous data, we're following all the rules. From a conceptual standpoint, and from how we feel as citizens and how we feel as consumers, especially for people who live in repressive societies, who have governments who do not have freedom of speech or freedom of press, this is a really, really big issue. And I'm sure all of you are reading about the pressure that U.S. digital media companies are under in China or in Myanmar or in the Middle East. So on the one hand, it's easy for us to look at it as being kind of a slightly creepy inconvenience when for people, those of you who are doing global planning, like sometimes this becomes a very real issue in terms of people's livelihoods and security and safety. So this is going to be a big recalibration, right? In the same way that, but I think that at the same time, it's still not fundamentally different from the direct mail era and the offline purchase data, the sense that your purchasing behaviors are being collected at scale. That's been happening since the 60s. We're just upping the ante by making it much faster and making the computational analysis that much more powerful. Thank you. Anything else? Good. We have time for one or two more questions. Should I pick on some people in the back? Yeah.
I was curious, you didn't really talk about your background. I mean, I read your bio, but.
So so my background. So I'm originally not really a math guy. I was a communications guy, and but I realized that for me, what I found more interesting than communicating was measuring communications. And so I started publisher side. I was at NPR and public radio, public broadcasting for actually about 6 years, and just loved audiences. I did a lot of usability work. I helped for NPR establish what the difference was between broadcast and online audience, and helped launch podcasts, which was a lot of fun. And then I went ad agency side because I realized I wanted experience in more than one vertical, and ad agencies are great for, those of you who are in agencies and you're working on 4 or 5 clients at the same time, know that your learning curve is just very steep. And I did that for 7 years or so, mix of creative and media agencies. And then I left agency life for Resonate 3 years ago because I realized that while I was leading larger and larger teams of analysts, so I had like 35 people at Universal McCann, and they were all basically doing the same thing. And they were all doing the same thing that they'd done for more or less the last 3 years. And I had this moment of realizing that if I wanted to advance methodology or to build new tools, that agencies just don't have long enough time horizons to invest the kinds of money that it takes. So I mean, like where I'm now, we've taken $29 million in venture funding, and it's taken like every dollar of that to build out the infrastructure, the methodology, the application layer, the UI, to be able to enable that interaction. And it's taken 24 months of like straight development with 40 engineers. And it's just really hard. I'm thrilled that I did that for all the life-sapping experience of being in a startup. But it's a very different experience from being focused on the next client deadline and having that be a very much like a week-to-week kind of experience. I highly encourage any of you who are interested in what life is like on the venture-funded side of the business. It's a fascinating experience. Do it while you're relatively early in your careers, and otherwise it's a lot of fun. It's very vulnerable though. I mean, like from the buy side, I mean, those of you who are on the buy side, there's a sense of empowerment that comes with having that degree of control, and it's very different being a smaller publisher or being a technology company that's trying to get itself established. And then I think we're just about out of time, but feel free to hang out or otherwise get in touch. Thank you.